That last song that was sang, "A Mighty Fortress is Our God," that's a classic hymn of the church, classic at least the last 500 years or so. Uh, but it was pretty controversial when it first came out. Martin Luther wrote that hymn, and he set the words to that tune, and it was scandalous because the tune was a tavern song. It's what people sang in the bars while they swung their steins. and So that's kind of, it may be apocryphal, but there's this quote that's attributed to Martin Luther when people gave him static about it, and he said, well, why should the devil have all the good music? Right? There you go. People have been finding creative ways to worship God for a really long time, and that creativity and that innovation has drawn controversy for just about as long. In fact, the story we're going to be looking at tonight is another example of somebody getting their nose bent out of joint over somebody else's expression of worship. We've been looking all Lent series long at Jesus in various conflicts. Jesus in conflict with one group or person or ideology or another, and we're going to continue that here tonight with John chapter 12, verses 1 through 8. But before we go there, I just want to bring to your memory, or maybe just sum it up in case you're not super familiar with Acts chapter 3, the story in Acts chapter 3, where Peter and John are walking into the temple, and at the gate of the temple, or in the courts of the temple, outside the temple, there's this beggar, and he was begging for money from people as they came into the temple. And the story that Luke tells us in Acts is that as Peter and John were going in, the beggar asks for some money, and Peter looks at him, and the guy gives him his attention because he thinks he's going to give him some money. And Peter says, silver or gold I don't have, but what I have, I give you. In the name of Jesus Christ, get up and walk. And that story was in the backdrop for a really, another really famous story that gets told quite a bit. And this story is about a conversation between St. Thomas Aquinas and Pope Innocent II. Maybe some of you have heard this story before. But it goes that Thomas was going to go visit the Pope, and as he was escorted into the Pope's office, the Pope, Pope Innocent II, was counting a large sum of money on his desk. And when Thomas came in, the Pope said, "Oh, what do you think, Thomas? The church can no longer say, 'Silver or gold have we none,' huh?" And St. Thomas said, "That's true, Holy Father, but neither can we say, 'Get up and walk,' anymore." And that story is used to illustrate how the church maybe got caught up in wealth and extravagance at the expense of mission. There's a problem, though. Pope Innocent II died 80 years before Thomas Aquinas was born. Story isn't true. It didn't happen. But I've heard that story a lot. I heard it in seminary, well, at one of my seminaries. As I was doing a Google search, it's repeated everywhere. I traced it to a book from the 1800s that has the story. It was a quotation book. But quick check of the dates can tell you, yeah, Pope Innocent II never had any conversation with Thomas Aquinas. How could he? He died 80 years before he was born. But the story sticks around, even though it isn't true, and gets told a lot, even though it isn't true, because it does illustrate a point. It illustrates a tension that has been in the church since the beginning between extravagance, or between, the church's use of money and the church's mission. I preached this sermon this morning at the Midland Church of the Brethren. I want to shock anybody. I do use the same sermon in both churches. And at the Midland Church, we just had to spend a whole lot of money there on the heating system. The pipes, it's a hot water heated building, and the pipes were leaking under the concrete outside. And it's like, to dig those pipes up was going to be just monstrously expensive. And so the cheap fix was $12,000 to fix the heating system. But it is way nicer to worship in a space that's 68 degrees than whatever the temperature is out, 34 degrees. People like it better when the heat works. And we're comfortable as we worship. The chairs that you're sitting on have pads. Cheaper chairs don't. And so there are these decisions that churches make, right, about how are we going to spend whatever money that God gives us well and faithfully, responsibly. But, my great-grandfather, Church of Brother and Power, he never had a padded pew, never had a padded seat, and they preached 3 hours long. There's no, it was hard oak, short benches. They did it. And so one person's extravagance is another person's necessity, in a sense. And so there's this tension that is as old as the church, and there's this story that John records for us here in John chapter 12, verses 1 through 8, that showcases it. Here it goes. 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany, where Lazarus lived, whom Jesus had raised from the dead. Here a dinner was given in Jesus' honor. Martha served, while Lazarus was among those reclining with him at the table. Then Mary took about a pint of pure nard, an expensive perfume. She poured it on Jesus' feet and wiped his feet with her hair. And the house was filled with the fragrance of the perfume. But one of his disciples, Judas Iscariot, who was later to betray him, objected. Why wasn't this perfume sold and the money given to the poor? It was worth a year's wages. He did not say this because he cared about the poor, but because he was a thief. And as keeper of the money bag, he used to help himself to whatever was put into it. Leave her alone, Jesus replied. It was intended that she should save this perfume for the day of my burial. You will always have the poor among you, but you will not always have me. May God add a blessing to the reading of his word tonight. So Jesus here has conflict with Judas. And we've got to decide, is this a wasteful act or a worshipful one? And the scene here is that there's this dinner. In chapter 11 of John's Gospel, right before this happened, Jesus literally raises Lazarus from the dead. Lazarus has been dead. He's been dead for 4 days. And when Jesus gets there, there's this great scene of weeping and mourning. Jesus himself weeps and eventually brings Lazarus out of the tomb, raises him back to life. And that event, that miracle, instead of having everybody who saw it and heard about it be ecstatic and praise God, that event did give some people great joy. Mary and Martha, Lazarus' sisters, were super happy, and their friends were super happy. But other people saw what Jesus did, and they wanted to kill him. And Lazarus too, right? Because the folks who opposed Jesus heard about this, saw this. Everybody knew that Lazarus was dead. And now Jesus' reputation, his fame is growing. More people are going to want to come and hear what Jesus has to say and meet Jesus. And that's going to erode the power of the opponents of Jesus. That's going to erode the Pharisees' power and influence and all this stuff. And so they want not only to kill Jesus, but they got to kill Lazarus too, because then if Lazarus is dead, well, see, he's dead. He didn't get raised. He's right there. Right? And so that was the reaction that we get told about. We don't find out then about how Mary and Martha reacted to this gift, this miracle. But maybe we do here. So there's this dinner that's given in Jesus' honor, and Lazarus is there too, reclining with Jesus. And this is something new I learned this week. When in Jesus' day there was a banquet given, the way the room would be set up, there'd be the table with food in the middle of a square. You can imagine a square, 4 sides. And on at least 3 of the 4 sides of the table, the square, there'd be a couch, what we'd probably call a bench. And the people would lay across the couch with their heads angled toward the table toward the center where the food is, and their feet angled away. So this is kind of in John chapter 13, which we're going to study at Love Feast. It says that John, the beloved disciple, leaned against Jesus' breast. And this is how it would have happened, because the way it worked, there was a lot of ranking in their day. So the most important person would have been kind of big spoon. Think about how, and there'd be about 3 people on a bench, and the most important person would be on the side, and his head would be closest to the food, and then the next most important person would be in the middle, and then the least most important person on the outside. If you had 3 people on the, so the most important person is there by himself, and the second most important person is able to lean back and put their head on the bosom of the person. That's actually their expression, was in the bosom, was you're the little spoon, right? If you're having this banquet. And so your feet would be off away from the table, and Mary comes up. Martha is serving, of course. That's what Martha does. And Mary comes up to Jesus' feet. And it would be easy for the people on Jesus' bench not to notice her, because their attention is either at the people across from them or in the food, whatever. But the other people dining would have seen Mary come up. And Mary comes, and she's got this perfume. And it's a lot of perfume. This nard was imported from India. Bethany, where they live, where this is taking place, is about 2 miles outside of Jerusalem. India, long way away from Jerusalem. Right. So it takes a lot to get this pint to Mary. Also, a pound or a pint, whatever your translation says, that's a lot. Most perfume uses here would have been about an ounce. And they used perfume to cover up the smells, right? I just told you how they dined, right? They're pretty close together. There's no dial, right? Nobody's got right guard. Right? There's no old spot. This is just, everything stinks, okay? There's not a lot of hygiene. You're talking about feet in sandals. You're talking about no indoor plumbing. The roads are littered with, the stuff camels and donkeys and oxen leave behind, and everybody throws their garbage and their sewage out into the street. It's a dirty, stinky place. And perfume helps, right? Perfume helps. And so this was powerful stuff, right? An ounce could go a long way to mask a lot of odors, whether you put it on yourself or maybe you just smear it under your nose, right? To make your dining experience more pleasant. So Mary comes with this incredible amount of perfume that came from a long way away. Judas said it would have cost a year's wages. Right? A day laborer's yearly income is what she's holding in her hands. And what does she do with this incredibly expensive, incredibly valuable, super precious resource? She comes up to Jesus' feet. Right? And feet were gross then. Right? Again, we talk about a love feast. The job of washing the guests' feet fell to the least important person in the household or the lowest servant. You didn't want to be handling somebody else's feet. But Mary, so moved with love and devotion to Jesus, so full of thankfulness that she has her brother back, recognizing who he is, she brings the most expensive thing she has, most likely, her most precious possession, and she pours it out over his feet. Usually, perfume and anointings happened on the head. Right? She dumps it on his feet, and then she gets down on her hands and knees and uses her hair to wipe the feet. Again, that's gross. We would think, right? That's incredibly intimate. You imagine wiping somebody's feet with your hair. Imagine doing that, right? Might be easier for some of us than others. But that's an incredible act. It's an incredibly forward act in her day for a woman to have her hair uncovered Now, for a single woman in her own house, wouldn't be quite as big a deal. But in different areas in the Near East, the different cultures, they had these different rules. And the further east you went, the more hair had to be covered. In some Greek societies, the hair of a woman was like the most sensual thing there was. So you had to have it covered when she went outside, so a man would know that the other guys weren't like checking out his wife's hair, or that the woman wasn't flaunting her hair and trying to say, hey, come on over, or something. You know, that there was this big deal in some cultures about the hair. And so there's a lot in the New Testament about hair. And depending on which region you lived in, there were different rules about what you had to do with your hair. But she took her hair, and it was uncovered, and she wiped Jesus' feet with it. And there's two people in the room whose reactions are recorded for us. And they're diametrically opposed reactions. Right? Judas is upset. Judas sees this extravagant, wasteful, prodigal act of worship and devotion, and he sees just incredible waste of resources. He says, we could have sold this. What? This is outrageous. This should have been sold, the money put into my purse, and then we could have fed a lot of hungry people with this. A year's wages, that's a lot of McDoubles, right? That's a lot of cans of soup. That's a lot of whatever. Could have done a lot of good with that money. And we have Jesus' reaction. Leave her alone. This was beautiful. She has done what she could. And everybody in the room, everybody else gets a choice. That odor, that aroma from the perfume would have spread and filled the room. This would have been overpowering in a probably a good way. I mean, this smells better than anything else going on, right? This smells better than the one who's in the bosom, right? When you're really up close and personal. And so this is a gift, in a sense, to the whole room. To everybody who chooses to participate in breathing in this generous act of worship. It could be a great blessing. And so we get to pick. You mean Team Judas or Team Jesus? What's your reaction? Who's on Team Judas? That's what I thought. All right. But that's because we see Jesus' reaction here. This played out, like I said, that story about Thomas Aquinas and the Pope, which didn't really happen. Really, when I was younger, maybe like lots of people, maybe like some of you, I was a lot more sure about a lot more stuff. I had a lot of opinions. I'm real happy to tell you about them. And one of the things I was real sure about was when I went to Europe a few times, there were cathedrals I saw there that were gorgeous, beautiful. And some of the cathedrals in Europe, they took literally centuries to build. And they were erected hundreds of years ago in times where plague and death and hunger and all kinds of problems were happening all over the world. And you look at these things, and there they go, full of stained glass and beautiful statues and all this stuff. And you think, what a waste of resources. How many people could that have fed? How much, these people were living in squalor. What is the point of these gigantic buildings? In our tradition, the Church of the Brethren, we took pride in our humility. And we would have these super simple meeting houses with hard benches and really simple, straight buildings, no frills, no anything. I mean, there were actually, this is embarrassing, but you can read annual conference minutes, and they're arguing about things like wallpaper and whether you should have brass buttons on your clothes, because that might be too ostentatious and too flashy. If you got brass buttons on your suspenders, you're kind of too freewheeling, right? And so there is lots of stuff that the church has kind of wrestled with and argued with over the centuries, and the priority between what the church does and what the church builds and how the church worships versus what the church mission is and how many people can we help. But Jesus, he does this interesting thing. He says, do both. You can help the poor anytime. You always have the poor. And if you guys know Jesus at all, he cares about the poor, right? He was not anti-poor. He's not saying, let the poor fend for themselves. He's all about, he's feeding the hungry. He tells us in Matthew 25 and a whole lot of other places, look out for the least of these. Take care of people. He says, yes, do that. Do that. But he also willingly and gladly accepts extravagant offerings of worship. What I've learned as I've gotten a little bit older, those cathedrals in Europe that scandalized me, or filled me full of this righteous indignation. Once upon a time, I heard another perspective that's at least tempered, if not completely changed my mind. At least I respect it now, and that is that what if for these peasants, these poor paupers who spent their lives trying to scratch turnips out of the ground to keep their families alive, what if seeing this massive edifice grow over their lifetimes and over generations of their lifetime and be completed, and it was a place where they could go in, and what happened at the cathedral was more beautiful and more transcendent. When they went in and there was light streaming through stained glass windows in all kinds of colors, glittering off of beautiful objects with pictures depicting biblical scenes and the pictures of heaven filling the space around them. And those buildings were built for acoustics that the voices of the choir would have seemed like they went up to heaven, and looking up at the ceiling, the biggest thing that they could have ever imagined seeing, would have maybe transported them a little bit out of the everydayness of their life into something beyond them. It given them a picture of eternity, of what it might be like to be in God's presence. And might that be worth something? Might that, getting to go every week to worship in a place like that, where you are transported out of the death and the decay and the poverty around you into some little more visual glimpse of heaven, to an illiterate population, might that have been worth doing? Okay. Well, you don't have to be convinced by it, but if you can see, hey, yeah, there may be a point in that. There may be a point in that. And that maybe it is that God doesn't mind extravagance in worship. Maybe a church can spend some money on its heating system and still watch out for the poor. Maybe a church can have padded pews and things that make us a little more accessible, a little more inviting to the people to come and worship God. Maybe a church can have, or we can have, sacrifices and offerings that we bring to the church, that we do in our worship to God, that yeah, maybe they seem a little wasteful. Maybe they seem a little unnecessary. But if you think about it, isn't just about everything we do to demonstrate our love to somebody we love sort of silly anyway? So Mandy likes flowers, and I like to buy Mandy flowers sometimes. And it's, in a sense, silly. The flowers are dead when I buy them. Right? They're dead. and in a week and a half or two weeks, if you get them a crow, they're pretty good. All right. But in a couple of weeks, they're going to be thrown away. Right? And so, oh, what a stupid waste of money. Why would you do that? You send somebody a card. Cards are expensive. Right? $5.99, $6.99. Look at the back. And it's a cardboard folded in half with a picture on it. Right? And you could call somebody, you could text somebody for free. But if somebody sends you a card or gives you a card, like, hey, I was thinking about you. I took some time and I took some effort, and I was thinking about you, and I wanted to show you that I was thinking about you, and so I had this little extravagance. Or somebody buys you something just because they think of you. It's something that's going to sit on your shelf or some little, there's no practical purpose for it at all. You didn't need it. It doesn't fulfill a function or a purpose. It's just, hey, I thought of you, and I'm going to give this to you. Lots of things we do. We buy somebody dinner. Well, they could have bought their own dinner. Lots of things that we do to show our love, to show our appreciation, to show our thoughtfulness, to show that we value this person in this relationship are, strictly speaking, wasteful or impractical or not economical. But maybe that's not the point. So when we approach our relationship with Jesus, we approach our relationship with people, is it wasteful or is it loving? Is it wasteful or is it worshipful? There's a place where we can both worship God with extravagance, with passion, with devotion, and fulfill the ministry to which he's called us to. I believe Matthew chapter 6. Pretty much all red letters. I believe that if we seek first God's kingdom and his righteousness, he takes care of everything else we need. That we can worship God extravagantly and have money left over to feed the poor and do all the other stuff that the church calls us to do. And I think Jesus does too. Jesus here, he has a pretty different reaction than Judas. So when you look at these two disciples, Mary and Judas, which one impressed Jesus? It was Mary. When you see a beautiful and expensive expression of love being performed, how do you react? What's your reaction to that? Here's a couple questions to think about as you get ready for our table talks here. How can a wasteful or impractical expression of worship actually strengthen faith? Right? And maybe if you want to make it even more personable, what is a way that you have demonstrated your love for Jesus? What did it cost you? Are you willing to do something that costs you? And of course, you can, as always, talk about whatever else God showed you in this time. Would you pray with me? Lord God, I thank you for this story that you've preserved for us. Thank you for your reaction to Mary's extravagant act of worship. Lord, Mary poured out every drop of that perfume for you. And Jesus, you poured out yourself for us. You showed us that extravagant love is costly and powerful, and that doesn't take away our concern for others. You weren't dismissing the poor when you said they'd always be with us. You were telling us we'll always have an opportunity to serve you by serving them. But serving the poor doesn't mean we won't have anything left over to worship you with. I pray that you'd help us, Lord, to navigate our financial responsibilities and to be prudent and wise stewards with whatever you give us. But also, God, help us to never be stingy when it comes to our love and our worship of you and our love for the rest of humanity made in your image. We pray all this in your name, Jesus, and for the sake of your kingdom. Amen.